Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 2. In the humid heat of Jakarta in mid-1960, the streets buzzed with political tension, colonial hangovers, and the cautious optimism of a young republic. Indonesia was still finding its footing, freshly independent from Dutch rule, and navigating the complex currents of President Sukarno's guided democracy. While the public face of the nation was adorned with promises of nationalism, unity, and anti-imperialism, the undercurrent was rife with chaos, corruption, and clandestine operations. It was in this volatile atmosphere that the mysterious death of Darto Wirawan, a respected civil servant and political organizer, triggered a criminal investigation that would shake the capital and expose the shadows within the government itself. Darto was found dead on the morning of July 9, 1960, in his modest government-issued house in Menteng, an affluent district that housed many of Jakarta's rising bureaucrats. The initial assumption was suicide, a gunshot wound to the head, a pistol on the floor near his right hand, and a typed letter left on the desk, vaguely referencing guilt over national betrayal. However, the note's mechanical tone and absence of personal references raised suspicion. Darto had no known history of depression or political regret. Quite the opposite. He had recently been promoted to a key role in the Ministry of Trade, focusing on economic decolonization and limiting foreign monopolies, particularly those held by Dutch and Chinese businesses. The local police, under pressure to wrap up the case quickly, filed the death as a suicide, but whispers in the bureaucratic halls said otherwise. One such whisper reached the ears of Retno Sari, an investigative journalist working with a small, fiercely independent newspaper, Mata Rakyat. Retno, in her early 30s and fiercely principled, had gained a reputation for exposing land scams and military abuses in rural Java. She knew the smell of cover-up when she sensed it. Retno began her investigation discreetly, first speaking with Darto's widow, Kartini, who was visibly shaken but skeptical of the suicide verdict. According to Kartini, Darto had been in high spirits the night before his death. He had even talked about an upcoming trip to Surabaya for a trade negotiation with Japanese envoys. He was excited, she said, like something big was going to happen. Kartini also revealed that Darto had recently started locking his study door and working late into the night on documents he never discussed. The morning of his death, she found the door ajar and his body slumped over the desk, the pistol lying awkwardly near his outstretched hand. He never owned a gun, she added. This single detail shattered the suicide narrative for Retno. She began probing Darto's recent projects and connections. Darto had been investigating the opaque dealings of a company called Madura Exports Limited, a major player in Indonesia's growing rubber and clove industries. On paper, it was a locally owned enterprise. In practice, it operated as a front for Dutch capital that had re-entered the Indonesian economy through Singaporean banks, circumventing nationalization laws. Darto had allegedly compiled a dossier on Madura exports and intended to bring it to light during the Surabaya Trade Summit. Retno reached out to one of Darto's former colleagues at the Ministry of Trade, a nervous man named Sino, who met her after hours in a deserted warung in South Jakarta. He confirmed Darto's suspicions about Madura exports. He had names, Retno. Ministers, generals, maybe even someone close to the president. People were getting rich, quietly, by keeping the Dutch in business under new names. The implication was deadly. Exposing such a scheme would not only disrupt major economic flows, but embarrass the government, which was trying to present itself as aggressively anti-colonial. As Retno dug further, she learned that Darto had contacted a group of nationalist economists affiliated with the University of Indonesia. They had helped him decode the web of shell companies and money laundering paths used by Madura exports. One of these economists, Professor Umar Asmara, agreed to speak with Retno on the condition of anonymity. Darto had documents, he said, contracts signed in Singapore, meeting minutes, banking records. He kept photocopies, hid them somewhere. He was going to go public if the ministry refused to act. He was scared but determined. This confirmed a chilling suspicion. Darto had been silenced. Retno now believed that the crime was not simply a murder, but a political assassination disguised as suicide. She shifted her attention to the police report, which she obtained through a sympathetic contact at the Jakarta Police Department. The forensics section was suspiciously brief. The gun had no serial number and had not been dusted for prints. No autopsy had been performed. It was pushed through by someone high up, her contact told her. We were told to bury it. She also discovered that the last person to visit Dardo before his death was an army major named Satya Nugroho, ostensibly on a routine security visit. Satya had served as a liaison between the Ministry of Trade and a special military commission responsible for economic intelligence. He had been decorated in 1958 for his role in quashing the PRI rebellion in Sumatra, but since then his career had grown more opaque. Retno tried to contact Satya, but he was conveniently away on training at an undisclosed location. Attempts to reach his family were met with silence. A colleague of Satya, however, hinted that the major had recently received a promotion and new responsibilities involving national security, a euphemism that usually meant covert operations or surveillance. As Retno gathered the threads of her story, she noticed she was being followed. A black sedan trailed her twice while she moved between interviews. She began receiving anonymous calls late at night, silent on the other end, until a click ended the line. She moved her notes to multiple safe locations and typed her articles on different typewriters, wary of her work being confiscated or destroyed. By the end of July, Retno had compiled over 30 pages of notes, a timeline of Dardo's last days, and testimonies from at least 5 confidential sources. She was ready to publish, but when she brought the story to her editor at Mata Rakyat, she was met with an unexpected expression, not fear, but resignation. "You're not the only one who knows this, Retno," the editor said quietly, "but the stakes are too high. If you publish, this paper may be shut down. And you." He didn't finish the sentence. Retno didn't sleep that night. The weight of truth pressed down on her chest like a stone. But she also knew that Dardo's story had to be told. Not just for justice, but to reveal the machinery behind the Republic's shiny surface. A machinery fed by betrayal, secrecy, and blood. Retno Sari stood at a crossroads. To publish the full story meant courting danger, not just to her career, but to her life. Yet withholding the truth would make her complicit in the silencing of a man who had died for attempting to defend his nation's sovereignty. So she did what many before her had feared to do. She began preparing a special edition of Mata Rakyat, one that would not rely on government printing houses or traditional distribution. She contacted university students and trusted union workers, people who believed in Indonesia's right to transparency, and organized a small underground network to help circulate the paper if it was censored. Meanwhile, her investigation continued to uncover deeper layers of conspiracy. Through a reliable source in the Ministry of Finance, Retno obtained copies of letters exchanged between Dardo Wirawan and a mid-level banking official in Surabaya. These documents suggested that Dardo had tracked illicit monetary flows tied to Madura Exports Limited and another shell company, Cahaya Selatan Holdings, which operated from Macau. Cahaya Selatan, according to Retno's analysis, was funneling profits from Indonesia's natural resources into private European accounts, bypassing all state channels. The key was a coded transaction log, lists of serial numbers and international transfers labeled only with initials and project numbers. Retno brought the log to a retired cryptographer who had once worked with the Republican forces during the independence struggle. After days of analysis, the codes were deciphered. Among the names revealed in the logs were officials from the Ministry of Trade, senior military officers, and even an advisor within the presidential cabinet. The magnitude of the corruption was staggering. This made Dardo's actions even more dangerous. He hadn't simply discovered economic crimes. He had threatened the fragile balance of power within the ruling elite. Retno began constructing a timeline of Dardo's last month. Through interviews and surveillance logs smuggled from a sympathetic intelligence worker, she traced his meetings, phone calls, and movements. She learned that he had met Satya Nugroho not once, but 3 times in the month leading up to his death. One of those meetings took place in a military compound in Sejanting, East Jakarta, a location usually reserved for internal security briefings. Why would a trade official be meeting with an intelligence operative in such a place? More troubling were the details she learned about Operation Parexit, a classified joint task force launched earlier that year under the guise of economic stabilization. While the operation's official scope involved clamping down on black market trade, Retno's sources suggested it was used to mask political purges of whistleblowers and dissidents. Dardo's name had appeared in one of the operation's weekly surveillance summaries, under the category Subversive Economic Threat, Class B. She realized that by trying to save Indonesia's economy, Dardo had unknowingly stepped into the path of a secretive apparatus built to maintain the illusion of state control. The more she uncovered, the more the lines between criminal enterprise and government blurred. Retno was not the only one watching. Her apartment was broken into in early August. Nothing was stolen, but her desk had been ransacked, papers overturned, and drawers removed. She knew it was a message. "We know you're close." She relocated to a safer location in Bagar and continued working from a small room above a friend's bookshop. At the same time, a mysterious envelope arrived at her old office in Jakarta. It contained two items, a photograph and a cassette tape. The photograph showed Satya Nugroho, in plain clothes, entering a villa in Bandung owned by a wealthy shipping magnate, Agus Ramli, a man known for laundering assets for foreign firms. The tape was more damning. It was a partial recording of a conversation between Satya and an unidentified voice, discussing cleansing, the Ministry of Trade, and ensuring silence before the summit. It was the closest thing to a confession Retno had ever received. She arranged a secret meeting with Kartini, Dardo's widow, to verify the voice. Kartini listened to the tape with trembling hands, then nodded. "That's Satya. Dardo mentioned him the day before he died. He said, 'If anything happens to me, he knows why.'" With this confirmation, Retno finalized the most dangerous piece of writing she had ever committed to paper, a comprehensive exposé titled The Death of a Patriot, Dardo Wirawan and the Shadow Economy of Independence. It was a narrative of betrayal, corruption, and calculated violence, backed by documents, testimonies, and photos. The story ran in a limited batch of underground copies, printed in a student union basement and distributed through a network of sympathetic contacts across Java. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 48 hours, copies reached university halls, mosques, and tea shops. Discussions erupted across campuses and among civil servants. For the first time, the government's internal machinery of deceit was being questioned by the very people it had claimed to serve. But backlash came swiftly. On August 20th, Mata Rakyat's office was raided by military police. Retno's editor was arrested under the 1957 Emergency Powers Act and accused of sedition. Retno herself narrowly escaped detention thanks to a timely tip-off. She disappeared into the countryside, moving from town to town, her identity hidden by sympathetic villagers and freedom fighters who had once fought in the revolution. Despite the clampdown, the truth had already taken root. International news agencies picked up whispers of the story. Dutch and British newspapers ran vague editorials on Indonesia's growing internal unrest, while Amnesty International quietly called for an investigation into the press suppression. Although the Indonesian government denied all allegations and labeled the tape a fabrication, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Even among the elite, cracks began to form. Several mid-ranking officials abruptly resigned. Madura Exports Limited shuttered its Jakarta office and quietly relocated operations to Malaysia. Satya Nugroho was reassigned to a remote border command in Kalimantan, essentially political exile. Retno remained underground, refusing to leave the country despite repeated offers from international human rights organizations. "This is my fight," she wrote in a secret letter to a fellow journalist. Dardo's voice was stolen. "I'll make sure it is heard." Months passed. Though Retno remained in hiding, her story continued to ripple through the political landscape. A movement had begun to form, not just among activists and students, but within segments of the civil service and military who had grown tired of the duplicity. Dardo Wirawan, once a quiet bureaucrat lost in dusty ledgers, had become a symbol of moral resistance. In campus murals and leaflets passed in secret, his face appeared beside slogans, "Truth is nationalism." His name was now whispered with reverence, a martyr for the cause of transparency in a land choking on secrets. Meanwhile, Retno maintained her work through encrypted letters and drop-offs with trusted allies. Using a network of rural teachers, underground printers, and even a few daring trade unionists, she began publishing serialized pieces under a pseudonym in dissident journals. Each installment detailed a new layer of corruption tied to the Cahaya Selatan network. She connected the dots to foreign banks, shipping routes through the Indian Ocean, and gold exports falsely registered under tin quotas. One name surfaced again and again, Colonel Agus Santoso, head of maritime security in eastern Indonesia. Retno's investigation found that Santoso had used military escorts to move unregistered cargo from Sulawesi to Singapore under the guise of national security shipments. The cargoes were then linked to shell companies connected to Cahaya Selatan. Interviews with disgraced dock workers in Makassar revealed bribes, threats, and nighttime loading operations, some of which, they claimed, involved foreign intelligence advisors. At the same time, Dardo's former assistant, a soft-spoken economist named Bayu Rahmat, came forward with more documentation. Bayu had disappeared following Dardo's death, but Retno's allies found him teaching at a rural school near Wonosobo under an assumed name. Bayu provided copies of internal memos Dardo had sent just days before his death, memos that outlined a plan to bring the financial discrepancies to the floor of Parliament. More importantly, the memos contained annotations, Dardo's own handwriting, naming individuals he believed were complicit. Among the names were a senior general, a deputy finance minister, and a media executive who had once controlled nearly half of Jakarta's print press. Bayu was hesitant to speak at first, having narrowly escaped an accident in late 1960 when his motorbike was sabotaged. But Retno's persistence and the growing public momentum gave him courage. He agreed to record a statement and provided his sworn affidavit, which Retno smuggled to legal activists in Yogyakarta working on launching a citizen tribunal. The government, however, was already moving to neutralize the story. In early December, President Sukarno himself delivered a cryptic address about the danger of ideological confusion seeded by foreign interests disguised as truth-tellers. While no names were mentioned, the implication was clear. The state began a full-scale crackdown on alternative media. Dozens of student leaders were detained. Copies of Mata Rakyat and its affiliated materials were confiscated and burned. Some of Retno's key allies, including her printer and 2 university professors who had helped verify financial records, were arrested under new anti-subversion regulations. But the public response defied government expectations. Protests broke out in Bandung and Surabaya, with demonstrators demanding transparency, not just justice for Dardo Wirawan, but also accountability for the manipulation of national wealth. A new student group, Generasi Langit Terbuka, formed with a single platform: End Elite Corruption, Return Economic Control to the People. By early 1961, the tension had reached a breaking point. At a mass rally held in the fields of Salatiga, over 5,000 citizens gathered to honor Dardo's memory. Bayu Rahmat, with his identity now known, spoke to the crowd through loudspeakers from behind a canvas shield. He did not seek glory, Bayu said, but he understood that a nation built on silence cannot stand. We speak now, not only for him, but for every truth buried under bureaucracy and fear. The speech was broadcast illegally over amateur radio waves and picked up in parts of Sumatra, igniting further gatherings. Internationally, embassies began to take notice. Though foreign governments had once turned a blind eye to Indonesian internal affairs, the potential for economic instability and the growing press coverage of missing aid funds sparked discreet diplomatic pressure. The Dutch Parliament called for an inquiry into Dutch banks operating in the East Indies. The United Nations, while avoiding open criticism, quietly sent observers to assess freedom of the press and public trials in Jakarta. Faced with increasing scrutiny and public unrest, President Sukarno took a dramatic step. In a national address on February 5, 1961, he announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate corruption in the Ministry of Trade. The commission, though tightly controlled, was a nod to public pressure. It included a mix of political appointees and token academic figures. Retno and her allies remained skeptical. Nevertheless, the announcement marked a small but symbolic victory for their cause. But not everyone celebrated. Colonel Santoso, whose name had become synonymous with smuggling, was found dead in his Jakarta villa weeks later. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack. Retno received word from a military contact that his death had been arranged, part of a quiet purge to shield higher powers. Other figures tied to the scandal, particularly those named in Dardo's annotated memos, either resigned or fled the country under various pretenses: medical leave, foreign diplomatic postings, retirement to ancestral land. Retno, though still in hiding, was no longer alone in her mission. Young journalists, inspired by her bravery, began following in her footsteps. An underground publication named Varta Ketelan began circulation in central Java, expanding on her investigations. University law students compiled legal briefs in anticipation of public tribunals. Songs and poetry celebrating Dardo's life became common in underground art circles. By mid-1961, the movement had transformed from one of whispers and fear into one of organized resistance. Retno reflected on the irony often. A man whose only crime had been honesty had, in death, forced a reckoning far greater than he might have imagined. In her final letter before disappearing into the countryside once more, she wrote, "We are not the saboteurs. We are the repairers of what has been damaged by greed. The state may own the airwaves, but the truth needs no broadcast. It walks among the people now, and it cannot be silenced." Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In the humid dusk of early March 1962, the city of Semarang in central Java pulsed with the noise of traders closing their stalls, students hurrying home, and the occasional truck rumbling through narrow colonial-era streets. Beneath this surface of everyday life, however, a storm was brewing, one that would soon unravel into a criminal case that shocked the young nation. At the heart of it lay a man named Soemarno Adewiguna, a respected public servant, economic planner, and seemingly loyal technocrat of the Sukarno government. But behind his polished speeches and efficient office facade lay a tangled web of embezzlement, falsified land grants, and politically motivated disappearances. Soemarno, then aged 47, had served as the deputy director of the National Development Bureau, a powerful agency tasked with managing infrastructure funding as part of the ambitious Rencana Pembangunan Nasional Semesta Berencana, or the 8-year plan. The plan aimed to modernize Indonesia's transportation, agriculture, and industrial systems in line with Sukarno's vision of a self-reliant, non-aligned republic. Large amounts of money were being allocated to regional governments for projects ranging from irrigation canals in Sumatra to road construction across Java. In the name of progress, billions of rupiah, much of it foreign aid from Eastern Bloc allies, were pouring into the archipelago. It was under this umbrella of rapid development that Soemarno thrived. A graduate of a Dutch colonial university, fluent in both Dutch and Russian, he was regarded as an intellectual bridge between East and West. But his sophistication masked a growing ambition. Leveraging his bureaucratic connections and academic reputation, he created a ghost company called Indo-Baru Consortium, registered to a postbox in Yogyakarta and staffed entirely by fictitious employees. Through this shell entity, Soemarno began bidding on government contracts, construction of provincial roads, school buildings, and even dams, securing funds that were then rerouted into offshore bank accounts in Macau and Amsterdam. The scheme went undetected for nearly 2 years, in part due to Indonesia's chaotic administrative systems and the deliberate obfuscation employed by Indo-Baru. Project reports were routinely faked, complete with forged inspection photos, false witness signatures, and inflated material invoices. The local media, tightly controlled and heavily censored, never caught wind of the discrepancies. Most officials were too afraid to ask questions. Soemarno's record was spotless. He often appeared in newspapers shaking hands with Chinese engineers or sitting beside military commanders at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. He was, in every public sense, a success. Then came the flashpoint. In June 1962, a civil engineer named Tri Wibowo filed an anonymous complaint to the Ministry of Public Works. Tri, who had been subcontracted by Indo-Baru for a supposed dam project near Salatiga, became suspicious when he received payment instructions that led to a foreign-registered bank. The dam itself, named in honor of a nationalist poet, did not exist. The land designated for the project had never been surveyed. When Tri inquired further, he was warned off by a local administrator with ties to the army. Sensing danger but unwilling to let the issue go, he compiled a dossier of blueprints, receipts, and letters and sent it, without name or return address, to a young legal officer in Jakarta named Nuraini Siregar. Nuraini, the daughter of a Batak judge and an early graduate of the University of Indonesia's law faculty, was known for her integrity and stubbornness. She had joined the government's oversight division 6 months earlier, frustrated by the sluggish pace of reforms and eager to expose inefficiencies. The anonymous report from Tri immediately caught her attention. Over the next few weeks, Nuraini quietly traveled to Semarang and Salatiga, posing as an academic researcher from the Faculty of Engineering. She found not only that the dam project was a fabrication, but also that 2 other sites listed on Indo-Baru's project schedule, one a national highway extension, the other a rural electrification grid, were similarly non-existent. But what disturbed her most was the local silence. Village heads claimed ignorance. Clerks denied having seen any workers. The only consistent comment came from a farmer who said, "We heard there was a project." Then one man asked too many questions and left town quickly. That man, as Nuraini would later learn, was not the first to have vanished. Back in Jakarta, she traced several other small contractors linked to Indo-Baru. One had reportedly drowned in a canal accident. Another died in a house fire deemed accidental. A third, once vocal about non-payment, was last seen boarding a bus for Surabaya and never arrived. The pattern was chilling. It suggested not only fraud but intimidation, possibly murder. Still working in secret, Nuraini wrote a confidential memo to her superior, laying out her preliminary findings and urging a formal investigation. The memo was intercepted. Within days, she received a warning. An unmarked envelope arrived at her boarding house with only 3 words written inside: "Stop or vanish." That same evening, she noticed a man lingering near her building's gate, military haircut, wearing a plain batik shirt, pretending to read a newspaper in the dark. She didn't go home for the next 2 nights, sleeping instead at a friend's apartment. But Nuraini refused to be silenced. Using a university contact, she reached out to a Dutch-Indonesian investigative journalist named Willem Groen, who still ran a tiny but respected press outlet in Jakarta. Willem, who had documented the purges of former Dutch civil servants during the early days of independence, agreed to help. Together, they began verifying Nuraini's documents, cross-checking names and bank transfers. They confirmed that several payments from the Ministry of Public Works were sent to an account in Amsterdam under a company named Nova Ventura Holdings, which had no business records beyond its link to Suharno's university days in Rotterdam. By late August 1962, Willem published an exposé in his bilingual bulletin Lintas Facta. The article, titled "The Shadow Infrastructure of Java," was cautiously worded but damning. It did not name Suharno directly but pointed to Indo-Baru's operations, the non-existent dam, and the foreign accounts. The publication caused an immediate stir among embassies, economic advisors, and foreign investors. Questions were asked in hushed tones inside Bapina's meetings and whispered across the corridors of the American and Soviet embassies. President Sukarno, preparing for the planned confrontation over West Papua with the Dutch, was furious that the press had uncovered such a scandal on the eve of a nationalist campaign. But rather than openly suppress the investigation, he ordered a special audit under the command of General Ahmad Sutarto, a close ally but known for his unshakable loyalty to the Republic rather than any particular man. What followed was the beginning of a full-blown reckoning, one that would expose decades of rot hidden beneath layers of revolutionary rhetoric and bureaucratic camouflage. General Ahmad Sutarto's appointment marked a turning point in the unfolding scandal. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor and meticulous attention to detail, Sutarto was both feared and respected within the military and the civilian bureaucracy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who built fortunes through shadowy deals and political allegiances, Sutarto had risen through the ranks with a reputation for personal austerity and incorruptibility. His role in the anti-corruption unit during the late 1950s had earned him the nickname, the Iron File. With full backing from Sukarno himself, Sutarto quietly initiated a top-secret audit and investigative sweep under the codename Operasi Bayangan, Operation Shadow. The team was composed of trusted auditors, counterintelligence officers, and a few hand-picked civilians. One of them was Nuraini Siregar, who, despite the threats against her, was invited to join the operation as a liaison due to her first-hand knowledge of the Indo-Baru case. Her inclusion caused waves among senior bureaucrats, many of whom still believed the whole affair would fade into bureaucratic oblivion. But Sutarto made it clear, this was no ordinary investigation. No names were off-limits. No department was exempt. He wanted results within 60 days. The first breakthrough came within a week. Using confidential access to Indo-Baru's financial paperwork, the team uncovered a network of shell companies stretching from Jakarta to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Amsterdam. These firms, while legally distinct, shared the same document templates, signature patterns, and at times even the same mailing addresses. Cross-checking payment records, auditors found inconsistencies in over 70 contracts, many of which had been marked completed, despite having no photographic or physical evidence of completion. Bank transfers traced through Singaporean intermediaries revealed a recurring pattern. Funds deposited in Jakarta were routed through a dummy holding in Penang, Malaysia, then onto European accounts listed under fabricated aliases. But what turned the investigation into a full-fledged criminal probe was the discovery of a coded ledger hidden in a storage facility in Semarang. Recovered during a search of a decommissioned Indo-Baru warehouse, the ledger listed over 100 transactions in what at first appeared to be gibberish. With the help of a military cryptologist, the team decrypted the entries. They were bribes, payments made to various regional officials, police units, and even some members of parliament. Each entry contained a code for the recipient, the amount, and the justification: silence, permits, approval for Phase 2, security escort, and most chillingly, removal. Removal, as it turned out, referred to individuals who had become liabilities to the operation. Most were contractors, field engineers, or administrative aides who had either asked too many questions or refused to go along with the paperwork. At least 6 of the names in the ledger matched individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances between 1960 and 1962, including the subcontractor in Salatiga, whose body was later found buried beneath a false retaining wall on a half-completed construction site. Faced with this mounting evidence, General Sitardo decided it was time to confront Soemarno directly. The arrest, however, was anything but straightforward. Soemarno had long suspected that he was being watched. He had begun liquidating assets and making quiet inquiries about asylum in West Germany, where an old university friend had ties to the Indonesian consulate. But on the morning of September 14, 1962, before he could act, military police intercepted him at his residence in Menteng, Jakarta. Dressed in his usual neat batik and calmly sipping coffee, Soemarno offered no resistance. "I knew you'd come," he said to the arresting officer. "I've only ever tried to serve this country." News of the arrest was initially suppressed, but rumors spread quickly. Within days, the streets of Jakarta were abuzz with whispers of betrayal, cover-ups, and stolen millions. Though the press was still controlled, certain foreign outlets began reporting on a major economic fraud case implicating high-level development officials in Indonesia. Embassies quietly reached out to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for clarification. Sukarno, ever the political tactician, allowed a limited acknowledgement. A rogue element had exploited the development system and was now facing justice. Behind closed doors, Soemarno was interrogated at an undisclosed location. His confession, later leaked to a few members of the press, revealed a calculated descent into corruption. He claimed that the original intent behind Indo-Baru had been patriotic, to streamline development projects and bypass the sluggish bureaucracy. But the money was too easy, he admitted. There were too many willing to look away. According to Soemarno, several senior officials in the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Transportation, and the National Planning Agency had taken bribes or turned a blind eye in exchange for kickbacks or political favors. Some of them had used the funds to support their own re-election bids. Others had invested in offshore accounts or luxury properties in Singapore and Manila. One military official, now retired, had allegedly received a villa in Bandung in return for securing road-building permits. Despite these revelations, very few of these names were ever publicly prosecuted. The political climate was too volatile. With tensions rising over West Papua, the military's growing influence, and increasing pressure from both the Soviets and the Americans, Sukarno could not afford to open too many fronts. Instead, Soemarno became the scapegoat. He was tried in a closed military tribunal in December 1962. The proceedings lasted 5 days. With over 400 pieces of evidence, including the ledger, wire transfer records, and testimonies from lower-ranking Indo-Baru staff, the outcome was inevitable. Soemarno was convicted of embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud the state, and accessory to at least 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor at the Nusa Kambangan Penal Colony, Indonesia's most notorious island prison. The trial, though shrouded in secrecy, sent ripples across the bureaucracy. Dozens of mid-level officials quietly resigned. Several departments issued new anti-corruption guidelines. A few foreign aid packages were suspended pending new accountability mechanisms. But for many Indonesians, the message was clear. Corruption was not only real but embedded in the very structures that promised national development. As for Nuraini Siregar, her role in the investigation earned her both accolades and enemies. She was promoted to head a new internal monitoring division, but continued to receive anonymous threats well into 1963. Despite the risks, she remained in government, later becoming one of the founding members of the Anti-Corruption Commission formed under Suharto's early years. General Sitardo, for his part, returned quietly to the military. He declined any official honors and refused interviews about the case. When asked in a closed debriefing what he thought of Soemarno, he reportedly said, "He was brilliant. But brilliance without conscience is a nation's undoing." The shadow of Indo-Baru lingered for years, a cautionary tale whispered in corridors and classrooms. And although the country moved forward, building roads, schools, and dams, the lessons of 1962 remained etched into the nation's fragile foundation. The conviction of Soekarno was seen by many as a symbolic gesture, a demonstration that the government was capable of policing its own, even if selectively. But the reality beneath the surface remained far more complex. In the months following his sentencing, the corridors of power shifted quietly. Several of Soekarno's closest allies either resigned, relocated abroad, or were quietly transferred to less visible roles. A few vanished entirely. Whispers in Jakarta's cafes and university halls suggested that some had been given a choice: leave the country or face a similar fate. These were the unspoken settlements of the elite, rarely public, always calculated. Operation Shadow, though largely considered successful, was not without consequences for its investigators. Nuraini Siregar, whose testimony and fieldwork had proven crucial, found herself both celebrated and isolated. After her promotion, she took a short leave and traveled to Yogyakarta, seeking refuge in the quiet home of her aunt. There, away from the noise and eyes of the capital, she reflected on the personal toll the case had exacted. Her family had been threatened, her phone tapped, and her integrity questioned. She had lost friends in government circles. People who once praised her reports now avoided her altogether. The cost of justice, she learned, was often loneliness. And yet, in her notebooks, she wrote with conviction, "If our leaders refuse to clean the rot, then the future will inherit a hollow state." Meanwhile, the Indo-Baru scandal began to fracture the ideological unity that Sukarno had so carefully curated. The president, ever the orator, spoke passionately about revolutionary corruption, the idea that some corrupt acts were born from necessity in a developing nation. "If the West criticizes us," he said in one televised speech, "they do not understand the burden of forging a new identity out of colonial ash." But not everyone agreed. Within the military there was growing unease. Younger officers, educated abroad or trained in domestic academies that emphasized discipline and modernization, viewed the scandal as a betrayal of national ideals. Some saw in General Sutardo's investigation a model for a more structured, accountable state, one where personal loyalty did not outweigh competence. These ideas would quietly simmer into the late 1960s, when the balance of power in Indonesia would drastically shift. The media, still under heavy restrictions, found creative ways to reference the Indo-Baru case. Political cartoons emerged in underground journals, showing oversized briefcases labeled development funds being dragged into palaces by faceless men. One daring editorial in Sulu, Indonesia, suggested that Indonesia's greatest threat was not imperialism or capitalism, but impunity. The piece was pulled within hours, and the editor was briefly detained. Yet the message had spread. Internationally, donor nations expressed concern but stopped short of withdrawing aid. The United States, more invested in Indonesia's strategic position than its internal integrity, issued a mild statement calling for greater transparency in future projects. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, leveraged the scandal to argue that Indonesia required centralized economic planning, not Western-style public-private partnerships prone to abuse. Both narratives missed the core of the issue: a lack of institutional safeguards in a rapidly transforming nation. As Indo-Baru's remaining assets were liquidated, and many of its projects were either abandoned or absorbed by other departments, the Indonesian public remained largely in the dark. In rural areas where construction had ceased mid-project, frustration turned to cynicism. Villages promised new roads and water systems were left with rusting machinery and half-built structures overtaken by jungle growth. Some communities repurposed these skeletons, using concrete blocks as meeting points, hollowed water tanks as storage sheds. It was a quiet form of defiance, repurposing the broken promises of the elite. In Jakarta, the government introduced a new agency, Badan Pengawasan Pembangunan Nasional, BPPN, or the National Development Oversight Body. Its mandate was to review all infrastructure projects exceeding 1 million rupiah and to publish annual reports. However, critics quickly pointed out that the agency was staffed by many of the same bureaucrats who had served under Soekarno. Its reports were vague, delayed, and often omitted key figures. By the end of 1963, the agency had become another cog in the bureaucracy, more symbolic than effective. General Sutardo, seeing the writing on the wall, submitted his retirement from investigative duties in mid-1963. He returned to a strategic advisory role within the army, but never again let a civilian probe. When asked in a confidential exit memo what he had learned, he wrote, "That rot begins in shadows, but flourishes in light when no one dares to name it." His words were never published, but circulated quietly among reformist officers. In the penal colony of Nusakambangan, Soemarno remained a model prisoner. He taught basic literacy to fellow inmates, and occasionally assisted prison staff with administrative tasks. A few years later, a sympathetic warden arranged for him to write memoirs, strictly for internal review. The manuscript, smuggled out by a former guard in 1967, was later published anonymously under the title Beneath the Asphalt. It became an underground classic, read by student activists and young bureaucrats disillusioned with the system. By the end of the decade, the legacy of Indo-Baru had become a kind of myth, part cautionary tale, part suppressed memory. For the new generation rising under Suharto's new order, it served both as a warning and a mirror. Anti-corruption slogans would be plastered across billboards and classrooms, while behind the scenes, new networks of patronage quietly took root. Nuraini Siregar eventually left government work. In 1968, she took a position at the University of Indonesia, teaching ethics and public policy. Her lectures were well attended, her stories gripping, though she never named names. A system, she would say, is only as strong as the people who dare to hold it accountable. In a final interview before her retirement in 1985, she was asked what she remembered most from those days. She paused and answered, "The silence in the office after we read the ledger." It wasn't shock. It was recognition. We had all known. But now we could no longer pretend not to. The Indo-Baru scandal of 1962 became a chapter rarely taught in schools, yet whispered about in policy meetings and passed around in old yellowed pages by those who believed that nations, like people, carry their ghosts. It was above all a moment of revelation, brief, burning, and largely ignored, before the machinery of state resumed its steady grind. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In the early months of 1964, the streets of Medan, North Sumatra, buzzed with anticipation and tension. Indonesia, just 19 years after its independence, was still navigating the turbulent waters of nation-building. Sukarno's call for guided democracy reverberated across the archipelago, emphasizing unity under strong leadership. But beneath the patriotic slogans and red and white flags lay a festering undercurrent of corruption, espionage, and political violence. It was within this volatile environment that the mysterious case of Operation Lantern emerged, a tangled web of illicit arms deals, foreign involvement, and a high-profile murder that would grip the country for months. The case began with the death of Colonel Hassan Wadagdo, a well-respected military logistics officer, found lifeless in his government-issued sedan parked on a side road near the Belouan port. His throat was slit with clinical precision, and his sidearm remained untouched in the glove compartment. No valuables were taken, no sign of forced entry, only a single torn page from a Soviet-printed technical manual left folded on the passenger seat. It was clear this was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Colonel Wadagdo had recently returned from a government-sanctioned visit to Czechoslovakia, where he had been overseeing the import of surplus Eastern Bloc armaments, part of Indonesia's military expansion program. His death sent shockwaves through the Ministry of Defense and raised uncomfortable questions about internal security and foreign manipulation. As tensions rose between factions within the armed forces, the central government quietly commissioned a classified inquiry. Led by Inspector Reno Adewanata, a rising star within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, known for his methodical mind and disdain for political interference. Reno, a former lawyer and self-proclaimed nationalist, began his investigation in near total secrecy. His team, consisting of 2 hand-picked assistants and a military liaison officer, established a temporary base at a disused customs warehouse near the port. There, they began piecing together the colonel's final movements. Port logs showed that Wadagdo had been inspecting a Czech shipment of small arms and munitions just 2 days before his murder. The manifest listed crates of rifles and ammunition, but a hidden ledger found inside the colonel's briefcase suggested something more. References to -7 Malawian Kwacha's devices and coded entries labeled Lantern. None of these were accounted for in official reports. Parallel to Reno's inquiry, whispers began to circulate among dock workers and low-level military personnel about unusual night shipments being ferried into private warehouses. Several witnesses described foreign technicians, some with Slavic accents, moving heavy crates late at night under the protection of Indonesian military escorts. One name repeatedly surfaced: Anton Dubček, an alleged Czechoslovak trade consultant whose credentials could not be verified. Reno eventually uncovered that Dubček had been granted diplomatic immunity under a questionable exchange agreement signed months earlier. Though officially tied to trade negotiations, Dubček's movements aligned eerily with several arms shipments and with the colonel's disappearance. A breakthrough came when Reno's team raided a rented villa in the outskirts of Medan used by Dubček and his associates. Hidden beneath a false floor in the garage, investigators found an illegal shortwave transceiver tuned to a frequency commonly used by Soviet intelligence networks. The equipment, along with a hidden cache of photographs, documents, and maps marked with shipping routes and military depots, confirmed that Dubček was more than a trade liaison. He was a foreign agent embedded deep within a covert arms smuggling operation. Yet the real shock came from within. The operation had not only been allowed to proceed, but facilitated by high-ranking Indonesian officials. Reno's team traced forged documentation and shipment clearance back to the Office of Strategic Procurement, a department headed by General Arif Sujono, a veteran of the Independence War and a decorated officer. Though revered by many in the army, Arif's signature appeared on at least 3 of the falsified manifests. Even more damning were the audio recordings recovered from a wiretap placed on Dubček's Medan residence. In one conversation, Arif's voice was clearly heard saying, "Tell them we're committed, but we need those devices before July. Widagdo is asking too many questions, keep him quiet if you must." Reno was shaken. He had admired Sujono as a child, having once seen him speak in Semarang during a post-independence tour. To now face the possibility that the general was complicit in treason felt like a betrayal of the ideals he had sworn to protect. Nevertheless, the evidence was irrefutable. But bringing charges against a figure as powerful as General Arif required more than proof. It required political will. Reno submitted a full report to Jakarta, only to be summoned days later to the capital, where he was met not with accolades but silence. He waited in a government office for nearly 8 hours before being ushered into a private meeting with the Minister of Defense, who warned him in veiled language. "Indonesia is not ready for this truth. Your loyalty should be to stability, not headlines." Frustrated but undeterred, Reno made the risky decision to go public. He leaked sections of the report to Sinar Malam, a Jakarta-based investigative newspaper with a history of publishing exposés on political misconduct. Within days, the story broke nationally, and Operation Lantern became front-page news. The public was outraged. University students held protests demanding transparency and accountability. Sukarno, cornered and furious, publicly condemned the traitors among us, while simultaneously initiating an internal military reshuffle. General Arif was quietly retired under the guise of health concerns, while Anton Dubček vanished, his last known sighting at Polonia Airport boarding a diplomatic flight to Moscow. The villa in Medan was demolished, and Colonel Widagdo was posthumously awarded the Bintang Mahaputra Medal, buried with full honors as a patriot who had given his life in service of the Republic. Yet the official narrative told only part of the story. Reno Adewinata, despite his role in uncovering the scandal, was transferred to a minor post in Maluku, far from the corridors of power. He accepted the position without protest, but in a letter to a close friend he wrote, "Justice in this country is a lantern in the fog, bright enough to see, too faint to follow." The fallout from Operation Lantern rippled through the Indonesian political and military landscape in ways both visible and invisible. In the months following the exposure of the arms smuggling ring, official statements framed the scandal as the isolated misdeeds of a few rogue actors. Yet behind closed doors, government agencies, embassies, and factions within the military scrambled to assess the deeper implications. The covert operation had not only involved high-level military corruption, but also revealed glaring weaknesses in the country's national security infrastructure, vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence services had clearly exploited. In Jakarta, the cabinet was forced to convene multiple emergency sessions to address the public outrage. Students from the University of Indonesia and Gajah Mada marched in the streets carrying placards that read, "Reform the generals or replace them," and "Widagdo died for truth, will we?" Sukarno, feeling the pressure from both the army and the people, walked a tightrope between condemnation and denial. He blamed foreign provocateurs for attempting to destabilize the Republic, while vaguely acknowledging that some domestic mistakes may have been made. It was a masterclass in political deflection. Meanwhile, Inspector Reno Adewanata found himself increasingly isolated. Though hailed as a hero by segments of the public and civil society, within government circles he was treated as a liability. His reassignment to Maluku was framed as a routine rotation, but insiders knew it was a form of exile. The office he inherited in Ambon was barely staffed, its records a disorganized mess of petty crimes and bureaucratic delays. Nonetheless, Reno threw himself into the work, refusing to let the setback erode his principles. He began quietly mentoring local investigators and teaching legal procedure to younger officers. In his mind, the fight against corruption and crime didn't end with Jakarta. It began in the provinces. Back in Medan, remnants of the lantern operations still lingered like ghosts. While most of the contraband arms were seized and catalogued, at least 3 crates listed in Wadagdo's hidden ledger remained unaccounted for. Reno had believed they contained -7 Malawian Kwacha's devices, proximity-based landmines capable of large-scale damage. Several months later, unconfirmed reports surfaced of similar devices being used by rebel groups in Kalimantan, raising the haunting possibility that some of the illicit arms had been redirected into the hands of insurgents. Further complicating the aftermath was the ambiguous role of foreign actors. The Czech embassy denied any knowledge of Dubček's true identity, dismissing the accusations as anti-socialist paranoia. Yet Western intelligence assessments, leaked years later, would confirm that Dubček had been an operative of the STB, the Czechoslovak State Security Agency, working under Moscow's guidance. Indonesia, seen at the time as a geopolitical fulcrum during the Cold War, had become fertile ground for espionage, and Operation Lantern was merely one of many subterranean conflicts being fought under the guise of trade and diplomacy. A parliamentary committee was eventually formed to review security protocols regarding foreign military procurement, but its findings were never published. Opposition politicians accused the committee of being a smokescreen, noting that several of its members were closely allied with the same military figures implicated in the scandal. For all the noise, no formal prosecutions were brought against General Arif Sujono or his immediate subordinates. Instead, they faded into retirement, their reputations bruised but not broken. Arif moved to Bandung and opened a private consultancy for logistics firms, giving occasional speeches about national unity and vigilance. It was Colonel Wadagdo's family who bore the quiet weight of sacrifice. His widow, Siti Rukmini, became an outspoken critic of military corruption. She turned their home into a small foundation dedicated to ethics and public service, hosting community seminars and supporting the education of children from low-income military families. Her son, Adifir, only 9 when his father was murdered, would later enter the National Police Force, eventually rising to become a reform-minded commissioner known for his integrity. The Wadagdo name, tarnished by whispers during the early days of the investigation, slowly became a symbol of courage. As for Reno, his contributions went largely unrecognized in the official record. But among those who worked with him, he was remembered as a man of unwavering conviction. In 1970, during a brief visit to Jakarta, he met with a group of university students studying law. One of them asked whether he regretted exposing the scandal, knowing it had cost him his career. Reno paused for a long moment before answering. "Justice is not always rewarded," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we stop seeking it." By the end of the decade, Reno would retire early from government service, moving to Yogyakarta, where he taught criminology and legal ethics at a small private college. His lectures, often filled with anecdotes from his investigative days, were not only informative but quietly subversive, urging students to question authority, verify everything, and never let fear override their sense of duty. Though Operation Lantern was buried in the annals of history, overshadowed by later national upheavals, including the violent transition from Sukarno to Suharto, its lessons remained potent. It revealed how criminal enterprises could weave themselves seamlessly into state institutions, how foreign interests could manipulate domestic vulnerabilities, and how a single, determined individual could momentarily disrupt an entire machine built on secrecy. Today, documents related to the case remain partially classified in both Indonesia and abroad. But among scholars and journalists who have dared to probe into Cold War-era intelligence operations in Southeast Asia, Lantern is often cited as a quintessential example of deep corruption in the post-colonial state, where the boundaries between patriotism, power, and profit blur beyond recognition. In the end, The case of Colonel Wadagdo was not just about a murder or a smuggling ring. It was about a nation still defining itself, caught between ideals and survival, between independence and influence. It was a reminder that the fight for justice, especially in young democracies, is never straightforward, never safe, and never truly over. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In the sweltering heat of Jakarta's dry season in August 1976, a strange silence blanketed the compound of the Indonesian National Archives. Located on Jalan Gadjah Mada, the colonial-era building had stood since the Dutch East Indies period, its tall white walls bearing witness to the changing tides of power and governance. But in the early hours of August 12th, silence gave way to gunfire. By dawn, the national news was ablaze with an unbelievable headline. Top archivist found dead, files missing in apparent break-in. The victim was Professor Dr. Gunardo Wijaya, a 61-year-old historian, well respected for his work in preserving Indonesia's early independence records. He had served as chief archivist since 1969, having previously held academic posts in Surabaya and Bandung. On the surface, Gunardo's death appeared to be a tragic robbery gone wrong. He had been found face down in his office, a bullet wound to the back of the head, his desk drawers pried open, and several key files missing. But to those who knew the man, nothing about the scene made sense. Gunardo was known to live modestly and had little of monetary value in his office. The few antique maps and framed photographs were untouched. His wristwatch was still on his person. What was missing, however, were two highly sensitive archival files, one labeled Operasi Raw Hitam, 1965, and another marked Kepulauan Aru, Intelligent Operative. These were not ordinary records. Both were tied to covert military operations in the post-1965 period, when Indonesia underwent a violent purge of communists following the failed coup attributed to the PKI. The investigation fell under the jurisdiction of the Kepolisian Negara, but early inquiries were quickly redirected to Kopkamtib, the operational command for the restoration of security and order, a powerful body that operated parallel to the official government structure, reporting directly to President Suharto. Lead investigator Inspector Kartika Nasution, a pragmatic and quietly ambitious officer, found her access to the case increasingly limited as military intelligence took over. But Kartika, not one to be silenced easily, began her own shadow investigation. She started with Gunardo's academic history and his recent meetings. What she discovered was a pattern. For the past 6 months, Gunardo had been exchanging discreet correspondence with a group of foreign researchers, including a Dutch political scientist named Roel Vandenberg and an Australian anthropologist named Kate Martin. Through intercepted letters and an informant at the University of Leiden, Kartika confirmed that Gunardo had been preparing to reveal documents that contradicted the official narrative of the 1965 events, particularly implicating mid-level army officers in the orchestration of civilian massacres in eastern Indonesia. Gunardo had confided in only one person, his estranged son Adi Wijaya, a photojournalist recently returned from an assignment in Timor Timor. Adi had arrived at the family home the morning after the murder, his hands shaking, his face pale. Kartika met him in a quiet cafe in Menteng, away from the official investigation, where he slid a brown envelope across the table. Inside were black and white photographs of military trucks unloading prisoners onto jungle roads, aerial shots of burning hamlets, and an image of a blood-soaked letter signed with the seal of a previously unknown army division, the Pasukan Rajawali. Adi explained that his father had entrusted him with the photos only a week before his death, warning that they could change everything if they saw the light. Kartika's next step was to trace the missing files. Through a network of archivists loyal to Gunardo, she learned that he had recently digitized parts of the Operasi Raw Hitam dossier. One microfilm copy had been sent via diplomatic pouch to a contact in The Hague. Another copy, it was whispered, had been hidden inside a copy of Pramedia Ananta Tour's banned novel, Bumi Manusia, stored somewhere in the National Library. Before Kartika could pursue either lead, her official authority was revoked. A letter arrived from the Ministry of Home Affairs stating that the case had been resolved as an isolated act of politically motivated vandalism by radical student elements. The file was closed, but she did not stop. Operating independently, Kartika contacted Kate Martin in Melbourne under the pretense of an academic inquiry. In their phone call, conducted in hushed tones, Kate revealed that Gunardo had been working on a truth file, a secret collection of government documents, testimonies, and photographic evidence that painted a damning picture of post-1965 Army operations, especially in Papua and Maluku. She warned Kartika not to trust anyone in uniform, and mentioned that a CIA contact had expressed interest in acquiring the files before they reached the public. Back in Jakarta, Kartika's every move was now under surveillance. Her phone clicked with the telltale echo of wiretaps, and she noticed the same gray Toyota parked outside her boarding house for 3 consecutive nights. Undeterred, she contacted Adi one last time, urging him to flee the city. The two met in a dimly lit alley behind the Wayang Museum in Kota Tua. There, Kartika handed him a forged exit visa, some cash, and a slip of paper with coordinates, where she believed the second copy of the archive was hidden. Adi vanished that night. 3 weeks later, news broke that a suspicious fire had destroyed a wing of the National Library. Official reports blamed faulty electrical wiring. No investigation followed. Meanwhile, Ganardo's name was quietly removed from state publications. At a commemorative event for archivists later that year, no mention was made of his death or service. Kartika, disillusioned but not broken, requested reassignment to Sumatra. She would later describe 1976 as the year history almost told the truth. Though she never saw Adi again, an anonymous package arrived at her office in Bukittinggi in 1979. It contained only one item, a high-resolution scan of a document titled Daftar Operasi Militer Tertutup, 1965 to 1966. The watermark was unmistakable. It had belonged to Ganardo. The document Kartika received in 1979 became her obsession. Its contents were chilling. A list of covert military operations carried out in remote provinces under the directive of high-ranking officers in the wake of the failed 1965 coup attempt. The operations weren't just military actions. They were mass purges, disinformation campaigns, and the strategic relocation of entire populations under the guise of restoring order. Villages in North Maluku, Papua, and Sulawesi had vanished from official records. Community leaders were either relocated or executed. It was history rewritten with blood and silence. Kartika, now stationed in Bukittinggi, carefully examined each line of the document. Operation names were coded in bird species, Rajawali, Cendrawasih, Merak, each corresponding to a separate theater of violence. Alongside each operation was a short description, a date range, and in some cases, the names of individuals processed. These individuals were academics, tribal elders, suspected communists, and in many cases, apolitical civilians. What disturbed her most were the annotations made in Ganardo's handwriting. Phrases like no tribunal, interrogation without return, and documented burial at Site 17 punctuated the cold bureaucratic language with horrifying clarity. The deeper she read, the more she realized the truth. The files Ganardo had died for contained proof of state-sponsored atrocities that had been systematically concealed for over a decade. But Kartika also knew that this knowledge was a double-edged sword. If exposed recklessly, it could cost her life. If hidden forever, it would allow the cycle of impunity to continue. She needed a way to protect the truth while ensuring it could be accessed in the future. She began by reaching out to an old contact from her university days, Dr. Macias Samad, a sociologist and cryptographic hobbyist with ties to several Southeast Asian academic archives. Together, they devised a plan. The sensitive documents would be duplicated and fragmented across a network of trusted academic and journalistic figures. Each would receive a portion of the material, unaware of its full significance unless combined with the others. One portion went to a Jesuit archivist in Manila, another to a political exile in Amsterdam, and a third to a Chinese-Indonesian newspaper editor in Kuala Lumpur. Meanwhile, Kartika planted a red herring. She leaked a forged version of the raw item file, stripped of the most damning details but authentic-looking enough, to a local tabloid. The publication was immediately banned, and its editor arrested. But the regime took the bait. Believing they had intercepted the leak, government pressure on Kartika eased, allowing her time to orchestrate the real transfer of information. In the background, whispers of Ganardo's murder began to re-emerge. A foreign journalist from West Germany, Heinrich Moeller, who had previously written about the 1965 massacres, arrived in Jakarta under the pretense of reporting on Javanese art. Moeller met with Kartika discreetly in Yogyakarta. His interest was not just journalistic. He had connections with Amnesty International and had been investigating disappearances in East Timor, which bore similar patterns to those in the Truth file. Kartika handed him a heavily encrypted microfilm and a list of names to verify. Among those names was a then-rising figure in the military hierarchy, Brigadier General Samudra Halim, rumored to have commanded Operation Merak in 1966. Halim's public persona was untarnished, a war hero, recipient of the Bintang Sakti, and a favorite of Suharto's inner circle. But the file contained a different story: testimony from villagers who had seen Halim order summary executions, a memo authorizing non-negotiated cleanup, and grainy surveillance photos of Halim at an unregistered prison camp in Serum. Moeller took the microfilm and returned to West Germany. Kartika knew that she might never hear from him again, and for over a year there was silence. Then, in 1981, a special report aired on Deutsche Welle. Titled The Forgotten Files of Indonesia, it featured excerpts from the documents Kartika had safeguarded. The report sparked international outrage. Human rights organizations demanded explanations. Several Western embassies issued veiled statements urging transparency in historical documentation. Within Indonesia, the report was swiftly labeled imperialist propaganda. The government banned Deutsche Welle broadcasts, and anyone found in possession of the material was subject to arrest. But it was too late. The existence of the files was now known, and although the regime tried to discredit them, seeds of doubt had been sown in the minds of academics, activists, and younger military officers. Back in Bukittinggi, Kartika lived quietly, watching the fallout unfold. Though she faced internal questioning, no direct evidence could be linked to her. The real files remained out of reach for the authorities, scattered across the globe like fragments of a buried truth waiting to be assembled. In the final years of her service, Kartika took a post in Aceh, far from the political epicenter of Jakarta. There, among rice fields and coastal villages, she found a kind of peace. But she never stopped writing, quietly under a pseudonym. Her essays, smuggled out through students and travelers, appeared in underground journals in Singapore, Paris, and Manila. Each essay told part of the story, not in full, not directly, but enough to preserve the memory of what had happened and why it mattered. In 1998, after Suharto's fall, a new generation of Indonesian scholars and archivists began to re-examine the suppressed history of the 1960s and 70s. A movement for historical transparency gained momentum. In 2003, during a symposium in Yogyakarta, Kartika, then 58 and long retired, was approached by a young historian who had stumbled upon one of her essays. The historian, teary-eyed, handed her a copy of a digitized archive from The Hague. Inside it was Ganardo Wijaya's original truth file, fully restored and annotated. The last page bore a single note, handwritten, "For the future, so we never forget." Kartika read it in silence, her fingers trembling as they passed over the faded ink. She knew then that Ganardo had not died in vain. The truth had survived. And now, it was finally being told. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. On the afternoon of February 14, 1970, a quiet unease settled over the bustling streets of Jakarta. The city, in its post-revolutionary fervor, was a mix of optimism and uncertainty. President Suharto had solidified his power in the wake of the 1965 coup attempt, and the nation was undergoing drastic transformations, from military operations to economic reforms. But within the heart of the city's urban landscape, there was an undercurrent of suspicion. An unsolved murder would soon cast a long shadow over the future of Indonesia's political stability. At the center of this mystery was a well-known businessman, Harun Prasetya. Harun had been an influential figure in the Jakarta business community, his company, Prasetya Enterprises, dealing in everything from shipping and manufacturing to construction. He was known for his business acumen, his ability to navigate the volatile waters of Indonesian politics, and most notably, for his ties to high-ranking officials within the military and the emerging Suharto administration. To the public, he was a man of ambition and success. To others, he was a shadowy figure whose dealings were shrouded in secrecy. But now, on a rainy evening in the heart of the city, Harun was found dead, his body lying in a pool of blood in his office building on Jalan Sudirman. The discovery of Harun's body sent shockwaves through Jakarta's elite. His death was not just another crime. It was a direct challenge to the fragile peace that the government had worked so hard to establish. Harun had been shot twice in the chest at point-blank range. The weapon was traced back to a military-issued handgun, leading investigators to suspect that his murder was not the result of a botched robbery or a personal vendetta, but something much more complex. The initial investigation, led by Detective Inspector Putra Wirawan, revealed a few key details. First, there were no signs of forced entry. Harun had been alone in his office at the time of the shooting, and the security system had not been tampered with. A single cup of coffee sat on his desk, untouched, as though he had been waiting for someone to join him. But the most perplexing clue was the lack of any apparent motive. Harun had no known enemies, at least not on the surface. His dealings were secretive, but they were also profitable. The company had numerous contracts with the military, and Harun himself was rumored to have a personal relationship with General Suharto, though this was never confirmed. Inspector Wirawan, who had seen his fair share of brutal crimes, felt something was off about this case. Harun's death did not fit the pattern of a typical corporate assassination. There were no demands for ransom, no signs of extortion, and no indication that Harun had been involved in any shady dealings that could have led to a violent end. Instead, there was a chilling sense that his death was part of a larger, more intricate puzzle. As the investigation deepened, it was discovered that Harun had been working on a project that could have jeopardized the balance of power in Jakarta. Precisia Enterprises had recently secured a lucrative government contract for the construction of a new dam in central Java, a project that promised to provide much-needed electricity for the growing population. However, the project had also raised concerns among certain factions within the government. A significant portion of the funds allocated for the project was being funneled through a network of shell companies, many of which had connections to senior military officers. It was rumored that Harun had become aware of these irregularities and was preparing to blow the whistle. The day before his death, he had met with a government official, a man named Hadi Santoso, who was known for his involvement in the military's financial affairs. The conversation between Harun and Hadi was the key to unlocking the case. Hadi Santoso was a former lieutenant colonel who had made a name for himself by controlling military contracts in the post-coup era. He had close ties to Suharto's inner circle and had benefited greatly from the shifting political landscape. However, Hadi's rise to power had come at a cost. It was said that he was involved in a number of unsavory deals, including the diversion of government funds for personal gain. Harun's investigation into the dam project could have exposed these activities, making him a target. Detective Wirawan's suspicion grew as he pieced together the connections between Harun and Hadi. He interviewed employees at Precisia Enterprises and learned that Harun had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his death. He had seemed paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, as though he feared that someone was watching him. One employee claimed that Harun had received a series of anonymous threats, though no one had thought to take them seriously at the time. In an attempt to learn more, Inspector Wirawan decided to confront Hadi Santoso. The encounter took place in Hadi's luxurious home on the outskirts of Jakarta. The conversation was tense, with Hadi denying any involvement in Harun's murder. He claimed that he had not spoken to Harun in several weeks, and that he had no knowledge of any potential threats to his life. However, his demeanor was anything but convincing. Hadi seemed nervous, his responses evasive, and he was quick to dismiss any further questions. Despite Hadi's protestations, Inspector Wirawan was certain that the former lieutenant colonel knew more than he was letting on. The more he dug into Hadi's past, the more he uncovered ties to shadowy figures within the military. Figures who stood to lose a great deal if Harun's investigation went public. The final piece of the puzzle came when Wirawan discovered a letter from Harun to an anonymous source, a letter that had been found hidden in his office safe. In the letter, Harun alluded to a dangerous game of political intrigue involving the highest echelons of power. He spoke of a blackmail scheme that could destroy the careers of several key military officers, including Hadi Santoso. With this letter in hand, Wirawan knew that the murder of Harun Precisia was not just a crime of passion or greed. It was a calculated act of political assassination, orchestrated by those who feared the truth. But in Indonesia's tense political climate, bringing the killers to justice would be no simple task. The hunt for Harun Precisia's killers had now shifted into dangerous territory. Inspector Wirawan was faced with more than just the task of solving a murder. He was now entrenched in a larger political conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in Indonesia. The letter Harun had left behind was not just a clue, it was a warning. A warning that those in power would do anything to protect their interests, even if it meant silencing those who threatened to expose the truth. The political ramifications of the case were immense. Harun had not only been a businessman, but also a key figure in the growing tension between the military and civilian factions within Indonesia. His dealings in military contracts, particularly with the dam project in central Java, had made him an indispensable ally to many. However, it also made him a liability when he began uncovering corruption within the ranks of the military. Inspector Wirawan had no doubt that the murder was not a simple act of revenge or greed, but rather the result of Harun's growing knowledge of the inner workings of Indonesia's political elite. The investigation was moving at a slow and perilous pace. The government had already begun to stifle public interest in the case. News outlets were given strict instructions not to report on the murder or any developments surrounding it. For the first time, Inspector Wirawan found himself at odds with the very institution he had pledged to serve. As he dug deeper into Harun's business dealings, the walls began to close in on him. He realized that the people who were pulling the strings were not just in the military, but also in positions of power within Suharto's administration. A break in the case came when a confidential informant, a former associate of Harun's who had fled to Singapore, contacted Wirawan. The informant, a man named Sugiarto, had worked alongside Harun in several ventures and had been one of the few people to have access to the businessman's private files. Sugiarto had narrowly escaped an attempt on his own life, and now he was ready to speak. He agreed to meet with Wirawan in secret. The meeting took place at a small cafe on the outskirts of Jakarta, a place where the shadows of corruption and fear were ever present. Sugiarto was a nervous wreck, his face pale and gaunt, as though the years of evading the authorities had taken their toll. He was clearly scared, but his resolve to speak the truth was stronger than his fear. "I know who did it," Sugiarto whispered, his voice trembling. "It was Hadi Santoso. But it wasn't just him. He was acting on orders from above. Harun had uncovered something big, something that would have ruined them all. He had proof of the military's involvement in the illegal diversion of government funds. He knew about the kickbacks, the fake contracts, the exploitation of foreign aid. He had everything documented, and he was planning to take it to the international press." Sugiarto's words confirmed what Wirawan had suspected all along. Harun's murder was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger conspiracy to maintain control over the country's resources and military contracts. But even with this revelation, there was still no clear way to bring Hadi Santoso or the other conspirators to justice. The military's grip on power was strong, and any attempt to expose the truth would risk the safety of everyone involved. Wirawan knew that the investigation had reached a critical juncture. He could either expose the truth and risk igniting a political firestorm, or he could bury the case and allow the military to continue its unchecked rule. But he also understood that Harun Persicia's death was a symbol of the corruption that had become entrenched in Indonesia's political system. If he let it go, it would only be a matter of time before another person, another innocent life, was sacrificed to protect the powerful. In the weeks that followed, Wirawan faced increasing pressure from his superiors to drop the case. His investigation into Harun's murder had already made waves within the police force, and whispers of his defiance had reached the ears of influential figures in Jakarta. He was summoned to a meeting with General Suharto's trusted military advisors, men who were well-versed in silencing dissent and controlling the flow of information. The meeting was held in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the capital. Wirawan was escorted inside by 2 armed soldiers, and the tension in the room was palpable. The men around the table were all high-ranking officers, their faces cold and impassive as they awaited his report. "You are investigating the death of Harun Persicia," one of them said, his voice low but firm. "This is not a case for the police. You are to drop it immediately. Any further action will be seen as an act of disobedience to the government. Understand?" Wirawan's heart raced. He had never felt more vulnerable in his career. But he also knew that if he bowed to this pressure, he would be complicit in the cover-up of a murder that had been orchestrated by those in power. His response was measured but resolute. "I will not stop investigating until I find the truth," he said. "If the government is involved in this, then it is my duty to expose it, no matter the cost." The room fell silent. The men exchanged glances, weighing his words. For a moment, Wirawan felt like a pawn caught in a game that was far beyond his control. But then, to his surprise, the men stood up. They didn't raise their voices or threaten him. Instead, they simply nodded, acknowledging his defiance in a way that was almost respectful. "Very well," one of them said. "But remember, Inspector, that truth can be a dangerous thing. Be careful what you seek." With that, the meeting ended. Wirawan left the building, his mind spinning with the weight of what had just transpired. He had survived this round, but he knew that the battle was far from over. Haroon's death had ignited a fire that could no longer be extinguished, and whether he liked it or not, he was now a part of the larger story, one that would eventually change the course of Indonesia's history. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. The year was 1976, and Indonesia was under the firm grip of Suharto's New Order regime. The nation had experienced years of political instability after the 1965 coup attempt and the subsequent rise of military dominance in governance. Yet, beneath the surface of economic reforms and military consolidation, there was an undercurrent of corruption, power struggles, and a growing divide between the ruling elite and the common people. Amidst this turbulent environment, a criminal case would soon unfold that would rattle the nation's already fragile sense of security. In the midst of Jakarta's ever-growing urban landscape, a brutal and mysterious murder took place that would challenge not only the Indonesian police force, but also the very foundation of trust between the people and their government. The victim was an influential businessman named Rudy Santoso, a man who had built his empire through lucrative deals with high-ranking officials in the military, as well as covert dealings in the black market. Rudy was known for his connections to the inner circle of President Suharto's administration, but he had also made a number of enemies along the way. On the evening of June 7, 1976, Rudy was found dead in his luxurious mansion in Jakarta's prestigious Menteng district. The cause of death was immediately apparent. He had been shot twice in the chest. There were no signs of a struggle, and the mansion's security system had not been breached. His wife, who had been at a dinner party earlier that evening, was the one to discover his lifeless body upon returning home. The police were immediately called, and Detective Chief Inspector Adi Kuzuma was assigned to the case. Inspector Kuzuma was no stranger to high-profile cases. A veteran of the Jakarta Police Department, he had seen his fair share of crimes, ranging from petty thefts to political assassinations. However, the murder of Rudy Santoso presented a particularly unique set of challenges. The man was wealthy and well-connected, and his death had the potential to cause widespread political fallout. From the moment Kuzuma arrived at the scene, he could sense the tension in the air. The mansion, a symbol of Rudy's immense wealth and influence, now stood as a grim reminder of the forces that operated in the shadows of Indonesian society. As Inspector Kuzuma walked through the opulent halls of the mansion, he noted the peculiar absence of evidence. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of robbery or theft, and no visible clues that could lead him to the identity of the killer. The crime scene was eerily clean, as though someone had deliberately ensured that there would be no trace of their involvement. However, Kuzuma knew better than to trust appearances. This was no ordinary murder, and there was more to this case than met the eye. Rudy Santoso's business dealings had long been shrouded in secrecy, and his connections to the military were well documented. He had made a fortune by securing government contracts for construction, arms deals, and resource extraction. He had been a significant player in the emerging economy of Suharto's Indonesia, and his influence extended far beyond business. It was rumored that Rudy had access to information that could expose the corruption that ran deep within the country's military-industrial complex. Could his death be linked to his involvement in illicit dealings, or was there something more at play? The first breakthrough in the investigation came when Kuzuma spoke with Rudy's wife, Maria Santoso. Maria was a quiet and composed woman, and her demeanor suggested that she was not entirely surprised by her husband's violent death. She had long suspected that Rudy's business dealings were dangerous, and that his political connections had made him vulnerable to the treacherous undercurrents of Jakarta's elite. According to Maria, Rudy had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his murder. He had become paranoid, constantly speaking of threats against his life. He had also mentioned several times that he planned to distance himself from certain military figures who had been pressuring him to invest in shady ventures. Maria did not know the full extent of her husband's involvement in these dealings, but she had heard whispers of his association with figures such as General Hadi Santoso, a powerful figure within the military who had a reputation for his ruthlessness. As the investigation continued, Kuzuma began to dig deeper into Rudy's connections with General Hadi and other members of the military elite. The more he uncovered, the more complicated the case became. Rudy's involvement in high-level government contracts and military deals had put him in direct competition with other powerful figures within the regime. It was not uncommon for businessmen like Rudy to use their wealth and influence to navigate the volatile political landscape, but it was also well known that many of these figures operated in the shadows, far from the scrutiny of the public eye. One key piece of evidence that emerged from the investigation was a series of bank transfers between Rudy's company and a network of offshore accounts. The transfers were substantial, amounting to millions of dollars in foreign currency. The origin of these funds was unclear, but Kuzma suspected that they were linked to military contracts and illegal arms deals. Furthermore, Kuzma discovered that Rudy had been in the process of negotiating a large arms deal with a foreign company, an arrangement that could have significantly increased his influence within the Indonesian military. But why would anyone kill Rudy over a business deal? Inspector Kuzma began to entertain the possibility that the murder was not simply the result of business rivalry or financial gain. Instead, it appeared that Rudy had become a pawn in a much larger political game. His knowledge of corrupt dealings within the military and his potential to expose these crimes had made him a target. In a country where power and influence were controlled by the military, a man like Rudy Santoso could easily become expendable. As the days passed, Kuzma's investigation brought him closer to the truth. He began to suspect that Rudy's murder was not the work of a lone assassin, but rather the result of a coordinated effort by those who stood to lose the most from Rudy's revelations. The more he uncovered about Rudy's dealings with General Hadi and other military officials, the clearer it became that the murder was a calculated move to silence a man who had the potential to unravel the web of corruption that bound the military and business elites together. The year was 1976, and Indonesia was under the firm grip of Suharto's New Order regime. The nation had experienced years of political instability after the 1965 coup attempt and the subsequent rise of military dominance in governance. Yet, beneath the surface of economic reforms and military consolidation, there was an undercurrent of corruption, power struggles, and a growing divide between the ruling elite and the common people. Amidst this turbulent environment, a criminal case would soon unfold that would rattle the nation's already fragile sense of security. In the midst of Jakarta's ever-growing urban landscape, a brutal and mysterious murder took place that would challenge not only the Indonesian police force, but also the very foundation of trust between the people and their government. The victim was an influential businessman named Rudy Santoso, a man who had built his empire through lucrative deals with high-ranking officials in the military, as well as covert dealings in the black market. Rudy was known for his connections to the inner circle of President Suharto's administration, but he had also made a number of enemies along the way. On the evening of June 7, 1976, Rudy was found dead in his luxurious mansion in Jakarta's prestigious Menteng district. The cause of death was immediately apparent. He had been shot twice in the chest. There were no signs of a struggle, and the mansion's security system had not been breached. His wife, who had been at a dinner party earlier that evening, was the one to discover his lifeless body upon returning home. The police were immediately called, and Detective Chief Inspector Adi Kuzma was assigned to the case. Inspector Kuzma was no stranger to high-profile cases. A veteran of the Jakarta Police Department, he had seen his fair share of crimes, ranging from petty thefts to political assassinations. However, the murder of Rudy Santoso presented a particularly unique set of challenges. The man was wealthy and well-connected, and his death had the potential to cause widespread political fallout. From the moment Kuzma arrived at the scene, he could sense the tension in the air. The mansion, a symbol of Rudy's immense wealth and influence, now stood as a grim reminder of the forces that operated in the shadows of Indonesian society. As Inspector Kuzma walked through the opulent halls of the mansion, he noted the peculiar absence of evidence. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of robbery or theft, and no visible clues that could lead him to the identity of the killer. The crime scene was eerily clean, as though someone had deliberately ensured that there would be no trace of their involvement. However, Kuzma knew better than to trust appearances. This was no ordinary murder, and there was more to this case than met the eye. Rudy Santoso's business dealings had long been shrouded in secrecy, and his connections to the military were well documented. He had made a fortune by securing government contracts for construction, arms deals, and resource extraction. He had been a significant player in the emerging economy of Suharto's Indonesia, and his influence extended far beyond business. It was rumored that Rudy had access to information that could expose the corruption that ran deep within the country's military-industrial complex. Could his death be linked to his involvement in illicit dealings, Or was there something more at play? The first breakthrough in the investigation came when Kuzma spoke with Rudy's wife, Maria Santoso. Maria was a quiet and composed woman, and her demeanor suggested that she was not entirely surprised by her husband's violent death. She had long suspected that Rudy's business dealings were dangerous, and that his political connections had made him vulnerable to the treacherous undercurrents of Jakarta's elite. According to Maria, Rudy had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his murder. He had become paranoid, constantly speaking of threats against his life. He had also mentioned several times that he planned to distance himself from certain military figures who had been pressuring him to invest in shady ventures. Maria did not know the full extent of her husband's involvement in these dealings, but she had heard whispers of his association with figures such as General Hadi Santoso, a powerful figure within the military who had a reputation for his ruthlessness. As the investigation continued, Kuzma began to dig deeper into Rudy's connections with General Hadi and other members of the military elite. The more he uncovered, the more complicated the case became. Rudy's involvement in high-level government contracts and military deals had put him in direct competition with other powerful figures within the regime. It was not uncommon for businessmen like Rudy to use their wealth and influence to navigate the volatile political landscape, but it was also well known that many of these figures operated in the shadows, far from the scrutiny of the public eye. One key piece of evidence that emerged from the investigation was a series of bank transfers between Rudy's company and a network of offshore accounts. The transfers were substantial, amounting to millions of dollars in foreign currency. The origin of these funds was unclear, but Kuzma suspected that they were linked to military contracts and illegal arms deals. Furthermore, Kuzma discovered that Rudy had been in the process of negotiating a large arms deal with a foreign company, an arrangement that could have significantly increased his influence within the Indonesian military. But why would anyone kill Rudy over a business deal? Inspector Kuzma began to entertain the possibility that the murder was not simply the result of business rivalry or financial gain. Instead, it appeared that Rudy had become a pawn in a much larger political game. His knowledge of corrupt dealings within the military and his potential to expose these crimes had made him a target. In a country where power and influence were controlled by the military, a man like Rudy Santoso could easily become expendable. As the days passed, Kuzma's investigation brought him closer to the truth. He began to suspect that Rudy's murder was not the work of a lone assassin, but rather the result of a coordinated effort by those who stood to lose the most from Rudy's revelations. The more he uncovered about Rudy's dealings with General Hadi and other military officials, the clearer it became that the murder was a calculated move to silence a man who had the potential to unravel the web of corruption that bound the military and business elites together. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. The year 1966 was a time of significant upheaval in Indonesia. The country was recovering from the aftermath of the attempted coup in 1965, which had shaken the very foundation of the nation. General Suharto's rise to power had led to the consolidation of military control, with the political landscape in constant flux. Amid this instability, crime rates had begun to rise as organized criminal syndicates exploited the weakened state apparatus. One particular case that captured the attention of both the public and law enforcement was the brutal assassination of a prominent figure, a businessman named Harsono Wijaya. Harsono Wijaya was a man who had made a fortune through his business dealings in Jakarta. He had vast interests in construction, import-export, and resource extraction, often working in close quarters with high-ranking officials in the military. Harsono had an air of invincibility, often flaunting his connections to military generals and influential politicians, making him one of the most powerful men in the country. However, in 1966, his life came to a violent and abrupt end. On the evening of July 21st, Harsono was found dead in his office, located in the heart of Jakarta's bustling business district. His office, a high-rise building that overlooked the city, had been the scene of what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated crime. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. Harsono's body was discovered lying across his desk, a bullet wound to his head. His hands were still clutching a stack of papers, but no other evidence could be found in the immediate vicinity. The police were quick to respond to the scene, and Detective Inspector D.W.I. Santoso was assigned to investigate the murder. Inspector Santoso was an experienced officer who had seen his share of violent crimes, but something about Harsono's murder felt different. The manner in which the crime had been carried out clean, efficient, and with no trace of struggle, indicated that it wasn't a random act of violence. It had all the hallmarks of a professional hit. However, what made the case even more perplexing was the victim's background. Harsono had been deeply embedded in the fabric of Indonesia's political and business elite. His murder, it seemed, was not a simple case of robbery or personal vengeance. It was part of a larger, more dangerous game. Inspector Santoso began his investigation by speaking to Harsono's colleagues and business partners, hoping to gain insight into the victim's life. Harsono had been a difficult man to work with, according to those who had been closest to him. He was known for being ruthless in his business dealings, often manipulating contracts and leveraging his political connections to push his interests forward. However, despite his cutthroat approach to business, no one could recall any specific threats made against him. It was as if Harsono had lived a charmed life, shielded from the dangers that usually befell those in his position. One of the first people Santoso interviewed was Harsono's personal assistant, a young woman named Siti, who had worked with him for several years. Siti was visibly shaken by her employer's death, but she managed to provide some key information that would shape the course of the investigation. According to Siti, Harsono had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. He had become paranoid, often speaking of mysterious people who had been watching him. He had also begun to make arrangements to move some of his most valuable assets overseas, a move that seemed out of character for a man who had always been so firmly entrenched in Jakarta's business world. Siti explained that, on the night of his murder, Harsono had received a visitor at his office. The visitor was a man whom Siti didn't recognize, but she could hear the heated exchange between the two through the thin walls of the office. There had been shouting, followed by a moment of eerie silence. Then, Siti heard the sound of a gunshot. She rushed to the office but found the door locked, and she could not gain access until the police arrived. Santoso pressed Siti further about the identity of the visitor, but she could only provide a vague description. A tall man with a commanding presence, dressed in a dark suit. Siti did not know his name, but she was sure that he was not one of Harsono's usual business contacts. The police immediately began their search for the mysterious visitor, but their efforts yielded no immediate results. They reviewed security footage from the building, but the cameras had been conveniently disabled on the night of the murder. It seemed as though the killer had known exactly how to cover his tracks. However, the lack of any physical evidence didn't deter Inspector Santoso from pursuing the case. He was certain that Harsono's murder was no ordinary crime. It was a message. But what message was being sent, and who was the target? The investigation took an unexpected turn when Santoso discovered that Harsono had been involved in a secretive arms deal with a group of military officials. The deal, which was brokered through one of Harsono's foreign business contacts, involved the illegal importation of weapons for use by certain factions within the Indonesian military. Harsono had always prided himself on his close ties with military leaders, but it seemed that this very connection had made him a target. Inspector Santoso soon realized that the motive for the murder could have been related to the arms deal gone wrong. Harsono's involvement in such a high-risk venture may have made him expendable to those who had once been his allies. The more Santoso uncovered, the more he realized that the stakes were much higher than a simple business dispute. Harsono's murder was connected to the wider political struggle within the military. In the wake of the 1965 coup attempt and Suharto's rise to power, factions within the military had been jockeying for control of the nation's resources. Harsono's role in facilitating military contracts and arms deals had likely put him at odds with rival factions, and his murder could have been an attempt to eliminate a man who knew too much about the military's clandestine operations. The year 1966 was a time of significant upheaval in Indonesia. The country was recovering from the aftermath of the attempted coup in 1965, which had shaken the very foundation of the nation. General Suharto's rise to power had led to the consolidation of military control, with the political landscape in constant flux. Amid this instability, crime rates had begun to rise as organized criminal syndicates exploited the weakened state apparatus. One particular case that captured the attention of both the public and law enforcement was the brutal assassination of a prominent figure, a businessman named Harsono Wijaya. Harsono Wijaya was a man who had made a fortune through his business dealings in Jakarta. He had vast interests in construction, import-export, and resource extraction, often working in close quarters with high-ranking officials in the military. Harsono had an air of invincibility, often flaunting his connections to military generals and influential politicians, making him one of the most powerful men in the country. However, in 1966, his life came to a violent and abrupt end. On the evening of July 21st, Harsono was found dead in his office, located in the heart of Jakarta's bustling business district. His office, a high-rise building that overlooked the city, had been the scene of what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated crime. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. Harsono's body was discovered lying across his desk, a bullet wound to his head. His hands were still clutching a stack of papers, but no other evidence could be found in the immediate vicinity. The police were quick to respond to the scene, and Detective Inspector DWI Santoso was assigned to investigate the murder. Inspector Santoso was an experienced officer who had seen his share of violent crimes, but something about Harsono's murder felt different. The manner in which the crime had been carried out, clean, efficient, and with no trace of struggle, indicated that it wasn't a random act of violence. It had all the hallmarks of a professional hit. However, what made the case even more perplexing was the victim's background. Harsono had been deeply embedded in the fabric of Indonesia's political and business elite. His murder, it seemed, was not a simple case of robbery or personal vengeance. It was part of a larger, more dangerous game. Inspector Santoso began his investigation by speaking to Harsono's colleagues and business partners, hoping to gain insight into the victim's life. Harsono had been a difficult man to work with, according to those who had been closest to him. He was known for being ruthless in his business dealings, often manipulating contracts and leveraging his political connections to push his interests forward. However, despite his cutthroat approach to business, no one could recall any specific threats made against him. It was as if Harsono had lived a charmed life, shielded from the dangers that usually befell those in his position. One of the first people Santoso interviewed was Harsono's personal assistant, a young woman named Siti, who had worked with him for several years. Siti was visibly shaken by her employer's death, but she managed to provide some key information that would shape the course of the investigation. According to Siti, Harsono had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. He had become paranoid, often speaking of mysterious people who had been watching him. He had also begun to make arrangements to move some of his most valuable assets overseas, a move that seemed out of character for a man who had always been so firmly entrenched in Jakarta's business world. Siti explained that, on the night of his murder, Harsono had received a visitor at his office. The visitor was a man whom Siti didn't recognize, but she could hear the heated exchange between the two through the thin walls of the office. There had been shouting, followed by a moment of eerie silence. Then, Siti heard the sound of a gunshot. She rushed to the office but found the door locked, and she could not gain access until the police arrived. Santoso pressed Siti further about the identity of the visitor, but she could only provide a vague description. A tall man with a commanding presence, dressed in a dark suit. Siti did not know his name, but she was sure that he was not one of Harsono's usual business contacts. The police immediately began their search for the mysterious visitor, but their efforts yielded no immediate results. They reviewed security footage from the building, but the cameras had been conveniently disabled on the night of the murder. It seemed as though the killer had known exactly how to cover his tracks. However, the lack of any physical evidence didn't deter Inspector Santoso from pursuing the case. He was certain that Harsono's murder was no ordinary crime. It was a message. But what message was being sent, and who was the target? The investigation took an unexpected turn when Santoso discovered that Harsono had been involved in a secretive arms deal with a group of military officials. The deal, which was brokered through one of Harsono's foreign business contacts, involved the illegal importation of weapons for use by certain factions within the Indonesian military. Harsono had always prided himself on his close ties with military leaders, but it seemed that this very connection had made him a target. Inspector Santoso soon realized that the motive for the murder could have been related to the arms deal gone wrong. Harsono's involvement in such a high-risk venture may have made him expendable to those who had once been his allies. The more Santoso uncovered, the more he realized that the stakes were much higher than a simple business dispute. Harsono's murder was connected to the wider political struggle within the military. In the wake of the 1965 coup attempt and Suharto's rise to power, factions within the military had been jockeying for control of the nation's resources. Harsono's role in facilitating military contracts and arms deals had likely put him at odds with rival factions, and his murder could have been an attempt to eliminate a man who knew too much about the military's clandestine operations. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. Indonesia, 1960. A year of political unrest and ideological struggle, where the turbulent post-colonial period was marked by a power struggle between the forces of nationalism and the ideological factions of the military and communist groups. The country was in the midst of a socio-political reorganization under the guidance of President Sukarno, who was leading the nation toward a vision of guided democracy. But behind the political stage, a more sinister story unfolded, one that would shake the very foundations of Indonesian society. The case of the mysterious disappearance of a prominent businessman, Arif Rahman. Arif Rahman was known in Jakarta for his success in the burgeoning trading industry. A self-made man who had risen from humble beginnings, Rahman's fortune had been built on smuggling operations, particularly the import of luxury goods and weapons for a variety of political factions. His operations had ties to both military officials and high-ranking political figures. However, despite his success, Rahman's life was not free from intrigue and danger. His rise to wealth had attracted enemies, many of them in high places. On the evening of June 12, 1960, Rahman was last seen leaving his office in the heart of Jakarta, located in a dilapidated colonial-era building that had once housed the city's wealthiest merchants. The streets were packed with activity as nightfall descended on the capital. Rahman had left in haste, his briefcase filled with important documents for a high-profile meeting scheduled the following day with key military officers. As he stepped into his car, Rahman exchanged a few words with his driver, instructing him to take a different route than usual. This would be the last time anyone saw him alive. When Rahman did not appear for his meeting the next day, his colleagues grew concerned. A few hours later, a report came in from a local police officer patrolling the outskirts of Jakarta. Rahman's car had been found abandoned on a remote dirt road. There was no sign of a struggle, and the car's engine was still warm, suggesting that the vehicle had been recently driven. However, there was no trace of Rahman. His disappearance seemed to follow a pattern of strange events that had been occurring in the city in recent months. A series of unexplained disappearances among Jakarta's business elite. The local police were quick to investigate, but their efforts were hindered by the lack of any solid leads. The case was handed over to Detective Inspector Rudy Sutrisno, a veteran investigator with years of experience in dealing with complex criminal cases. Sutrisno's first instinct was that Rahman had been kidnapped. Given Rahman's connections to several influential figures, it was plausible that a political faction, either from the military or the Communist Party, had targeted him. However, Sutrisno had no idea that this case would lead him down a far darker and more convoluted path. Inspector Sutrisno began his investigation by speaking to Rahman's business associates. These individuals, many of whom had worked with Rahman for years, were initially tight-lipped, unwilling to speak freely about their connections to him. Rahman's business dealings, after all, had always been shrouded in secrecy. However, one particular associate, a man named Yanto, agreed to meet with Sutrisno privately. Yanto was a former military officer who had turned to business after his military career had ended. He had been one of Rahman's closest confidants. Yanto explained that in the weeks leading up to Rahman's disappearance, the businessman had become increasingly paranoid. He had expressed fears of being targeted by political enemies, particularly from within the military. According to Yanto, Rahman had recently become involved in a clandestine operation involving the illegal export of arms to anti-colonial rebels in neighboring countries. The operation, which had been kept under wraps, was said to involve a number of Indonesian military officers who were sympathetic to the anti-colonial cause. These officers, it seemed, had used Rahman's business connections to acquire weapons and equipment for their operations. Yanto's revelation gave Sutrisno his first lead. The arms smuggling ring seemed like the most plausible motive for Rahman's disappearance. If the arms deal had gone wrong, then Rahman's life could very well have been on the line. Sutrisno began to focus his investigation on the military officers involved in the operation. However, he quickly realized that uncovering the full extent of the operation would be nearly impossible without drawing the attention of those in power. It was clear that Rahman had been caught in the crossfire of a much larger political struggle, one that extended far beyond the business world. The case took a further twist when Sutrisno received an anonymous tip. The informant claimed to have witnessed Rahman being taken by force in a dark sedan on the night of his disappearance. The vehicle, according to the tipster, had been parked near a military barracks on the outskirts of Jakarta. The informant also mentioned a man named Colonel Surya, a high-ranking officer in the Indonesian military, who was believed to have been involved in the operation. Sutrisno's instincts told him that Colonel Surya was key to solving the case, and he wasted no time in tracking down the officer. Colonel Surya was known for his hardline stance on communist insurgents, and had made a name for himself as a staunch defender of Indonesia's sovereignty. He was a decorated officer with a reputation for ruthlessness when dealing with political dissidents. Sutrisno approached Surya with caution, knowing that confronting a man of such power could have dangerous consequences. However, the colonel denied any involvement in Rahman's disappearance. He claimed to have no knowledge of the businessman's activities or whereabouts. But Sutrisno did not believe him. He continued to press Surya, digging into the colonel's personal life and connections. He soon discovered that Surya had been in Jakarta on the night of Rahman's disappearance. Moreover, Surya had been in contact with several military officers who had been directly involved in the arms operation. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Sutrisno now believed that Rahman's disappearance was not the result of a random kidnapping, but a deliberate move orchestrated by military officials who wanted to silence him before he could expose their illegal dealings. With his suspicions growing, Sutrisno sought out further evidence. He managed to trace the movements of Rahman's car on the night of his disappearance, discovering that it had been driven to an isolated military compound outside the city. There, he found a witness who claimed to have seen Rahman being forced into a building by armed guards. The witness, a local farmer, had been too afraid to come forward until now, fearing retribution from the military. Inspector Sutrisno now had undeniable evidence that Rahman had been abducted by military personnel. The path to uncovering the truth was becoming increasingly perilous. The stakes had escalated. This was no longer just about a missing businessman, but about exposing a covert military operation that could have far-reaching consequences. With the military's involvement, the case had become a delicate political minefield, and Sutrisno understood that pursuing it further could endanger not only his life, but also the lives of those around him. Despite the looming threat, Sutrisno felt compelled to continue. He couldn't allow Rahman's death to be swept under the rug. He decided to dig deeper into the military's involvement in the illegal arms trade and the broader implications of the operation Rahman had been part of. His investigation revealed startling truths. The arms smuggling ring was part of a larger initiative to supply weapons to pro-independence movements in other Southeast Asian nations, a campaign that involved several high-ranking Indonesian officials. Rahman had served as the middleman, helping to facilitate the transactions between arms dealers and rebel groups. However, it had become clear that Rahman had overstepped his bounds, attempting to take control of the operation and cut out the military intermediaries, which put him at odds with the very people who had once protected him. Sutrisno's breakthrough came when he managed to secure a meeting with a former associate of Rahman's named Hendra, a man with direct knowledge of the arms deals and the political dynamics behind them. Hendra had been a low-ranking military officer before becoming involved in the clandestine operations. Although Hendra had no love for the corrupt generals who had manipulated the system, he was willing to speak, believing that Rahman's murder was an unforgivable act. He claimed that Rahman had been plotting to use his knowledge of the illegal arms trade as leverage against the military. Hendra explained that Rahman had been in contact with politicians who were opposed to the military's growing influence in Indonesian politics. He had plans to expose the entire network of corrupt officers and businessmen who were benefiting from the illicit deals. This revelation was pivotal. It showed that Rahman had become a threat not just to the military, but also to the power structure of Indonesia itself. As Sutrisno continued to piece together the web of corruption, he realized that Rahman's death had been ordered by the highest echelons of the military, who had decided that he knew too much and was far too dangerous to be allowed to live. The cold efficiency with which Rahman had been taken, abducted in the night, hidden away, and ultimately silenced, was proof of the lengths to which the military would go to protect its interests. Sutrisno faced a difficult decision. The evidence he had gathered so far was enough to incriminate Colonel Surya and several other high-ranking officers. But exposing the truth would mean confronting the military establishment head-on, something that was fraught with danger, given the military's tight control over Indonesia's political landscape. If the case were to go public, it would trigger a scandal of monumental proportions, one that could destabilize the government. Sutrisno also knew that if he moved too quickly, he could easily become a target himself. The risk of retribution from the military was ever present. Yet, despite the threats, Satrisno could not back down. He had come too far to let Ramon's death go unpunished. With his hands tied by the power of the military, Satrisno resorted to covert tactics. He continued to meet with trusted allies in secret, gathering evidence and working behind the scenes to build his case. His efforts were further supported by the increasing unrest among the public, which had begun to grow suspicious of the military's dominance in the political sphere. At this juncture, Satrisno received a crucial piece of information. An anonymous letter arrived at his office, detailing the locations of secret meetings held by the conspirators. The letter contained the names of several officers, including Colonel Surya, who were believed to be directly involved in Ramon's abduction and murder. The letter also provided instructions on where to find evidence that would implicate them. Satrisno knew that this was his chance to get the concrete proof he needed. Following the directions in the letter, Satrisno infiltrated one of the military safe houses, a building tucked away on the outskirts of Jakarta. Inside, he discovered a collection of classified documents that outlined the full extent of the arms smuggling operation. The documents not only listed the weapons deals, but also contained names of political figures who were involved in laundering the profits from the trade. Satrisno had found the smoking gun, the key to dismantling the entire corrupt network. But just as he was about to leave the building, Satrisno was ambushed. A group of armed soldiers stormed the safe house, forcing him to flee through a narrow back exit. He managed to escape unscathed, but the close call reminded him of the dangers he was up against. Despite the setback, Satrisno refused to abandon his investigation. He knew he had no choice but to move forward, no matter the personal cost. In the days that followed, Satrisno's investigation gained momentum. The documents he had recovered, along with Hender's testimony, were enough to expose the full scale of the arms trade and the military's involvement in the illicit activities. Satrisno presented his findings to the highest levels of government, but the response was not what he had hoped for. The political leaders were too deeply intertwined with the military to take any decisive action. Instead, Satrisno was warned to stop his investigation, his superiors offering him a bribe in exchange for silence. Satrisno refused. He understood that his duty was to the truth, not to the political machine that had corrupted Indonesia's government. However, the forces arrayed against him were too powerful, and in the end, the case was quietly buried. Ramon's murder was officially classified as an unresolved disappearance, and the military officials involved in the arms deals went unpunished. Despite his efforts, Satrisno's pursuit of justice had ultimately been thwarted by the very system he had sworn to protect. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. Indonesia, 1970. In the shadow of the burgeoning New Order regime under President Suharto, Indonesia was undergoing profound changes. The nation was struggling to find stability after years of political upheaval, civil unrest, and the violent coup attempts of the mid-1960s. The military now held a firm grip on power, and economic reforms were being enacted to rebuild the economy. Yet, amidst this period of transformation, an undercurrent of criminal activity began to emerge, one that involved the very individuals charged with protecting the nation. This is the story of a notorious criminal case in Jakarta, a case that would shake the public's faith in the military establishment and lead to one of the most significant trials in Indonesia's legal history. The case began in early March 1970 when a prominent Jakarta businessman, Lim Tan, was found murdered in his luxurious home. Lim, a well-known figure in the city's business community, had made his fortune in the import-export trade, primarily dealing with textiles and construction materials. He was known for his extensive network of contacts in both the civilian and military sectors, which allowed him to secure lucrative government contracts and build a business empire that spanned several countries in Southeast Asia. However, his rise to prominence had come at a cost. Many believed Lim's wealth was built on questionable business practices, including bribery, insider trading, and illegal government dealings. The circumstances surrounding Lim's death were chilling. His body was discovered in his study, slumped over his desk, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing seemed to be missing from his home. The only clue left behind was a bloodied note found next to Lim's body which read, "The cost of doing business with the wrong people." The cryptic message raised more questions than answers and pointed to something far darker than a simple robbery gone wrong. The police were initially baffled by the murder. Lim's extensive connections with both the military and business elites made it difficult to pinpoint a suspect. The investigation quickly hit a wall, as no one in Liam's circle of acquaintances seemed willing to talk. Many of his business partners and friends had ties to powerful figures in the military, individuals who were known to have a vested interest in maintaining their hold over the lucrative contracts Liam had secured. It seemed as though every lead led to a dead end. The case was taken over by Detective Lieutenant Agus Santoso, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most complex of cases. Santoso's first move was to examine Liam's personal and business records. What he uncovered was troubling. Liam had been involved in a variety of high-risk ventures, some of which were linked to military officials and politicians who had been accused of corruption and illicit dealings. There was a pattern emerging. Liam's business dealings were not only morally dubious, but also involved shady characters with a history of violence and intimidation. Santoso's investigation soon led him to a man named Colonel Waira, a high-ranking officer in the Indonesian military. Waira was known for his involvement in several illegal operations, including arms smuggling and money laundering, and had a reputation for using his military influence to manipulate government contracts for his own benefit. Waira had been one of Liam's close associates, and it was rumored that the two men had been in the process of finalizing a massive construction deal involving a new military base. However, Santoso quickly learned that the deal had fallen through in the days leading up to Liam's murder, and Waira was among the last people to see Liam alive. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Santoso discovered that Liam had been receiving anonymous threats in the weeks before his death. According to a source close to Liam's family, the businessman had been afraid for his life, fearing that his business dealings with the military were about to catch up with him. The threats had intensified after a meeting between Liam and Colonel Waira, where it was rumored that Liam had threatened to expose Waira's involvement in illegal activities. This revelation was enough to convince Santoso that Waira had played a key role in Liam's murder. However, Santoso knew that proving this theory would be a monumental task. Colonel Waira was a powerful man with deep connections within the military, and he had the ability to influence the investigation from behind the scenes. Santoso was not naive. He knew that pursuing Waira would bring him into direct conflict with the very forces that govern the nation. But he also knew that the truth needed to be uncovered, no matter the cost. Santoso began to gather more evidence, focusing on Waira's personal life and his business dealings. He discovered that Waira had used his military position to secure multiple government contracts, often by intimidating or bribing local officials. Waira had built a small empire based on these deals, and Liam had been one of his key partners. But the business arrangement had begun to sour after Liam had started to demand a larger share of the profits, leading to tensions between the two men. Santoso's theory began to take shape. Liam had become a liability for Waira, and the only way to silence him was to have him eliminated. As Santoso delved deeper into the case, he began to uncover a network of individuals who had assisted Waira in carrying out his illegal activities. These individuals were a mix of military officers, business associates, and corrupt government officials who had profited from Waira's illicit deals. Santoso began to connect the dots, revealing a vast criminal enterprise that stretched deep into the heart of the Indonesian military establishment. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous his investigation became. Despite the risks, Santoso pressed forward, knowing that bringing Waira and his associates to justice was the only way to end the corruption that was poisoning Indonesia's political system. In the weeks that followed, Santoso worked tirelessly to gather enough evidence to bring Waira to trial. The pressure mounted as Waira's connections within the military and government made it clear that they would stop at nothing to protect him. But Santoso was undeterred. He had already seen the destructive power of corruption in Indonesia, and he was determined to fight back. The case of Liam Tan's murder had become a symbol of the broader struggle between justice and corruption in the country. In the end, Santoso knew that no matter the personal cost, he would continue to pursue the truth, because it was the only way to bring about real change in a society that had long been plagued by injustice. As Detective Lieutenant Agus Santoso continued to press forward in his investigation, he realized that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the situation became. His efforts to gather evidence were met with increasing resistance. The web of corruption surrounding Colonel Waira was not only vast, but also deeply entrenched in the political and military fabric of Indonesia. Santoso's investigation had become a precarious balancing act between uncovering the truth and avoiding the wrath of those in power. The more he exposed, the greater the risk of retribution, not just against him, but also against those who had helped him along the way. Despite the growing threats, Santoso knew that the truth about Lim Tan's murder had to come to light. He began working with a small, trusted group of officers who shared his belief in justice. They provided him with crucial support, often at great personal risk. Santoso's investigation continued in the shadows, as he gathered more damning evidence of Colonel Waira's involvement in illegal activities, including money laundering, arms deals, and bribery. One of the most shocking revelations came when Santoso uncovered evidence of a secret meeting between Colonel Waira and several foreign arms dealers. These documents showed that Waira had been involved in facilitating the sale of weapons to various Southeast Asian insurgent groups, which included rebel factions in Malaysia and the Philippines. Lim Tan had been a key intermediary in these arms deals, acting as a broker between Waira's military contacts and the international black market. However, Lim's increasing dissatisfaction with the operation had led to a break in their partnership, making him a liability to Waira. With the help of his trusted informants, Santoso managed to locate the safe house where the arms deals had been taking place. Inside, he found more documents and audio tapes that directly linked Colonel Waira to the international weapons network. The evidence was irrefutable. Waira had been involved in illegal dealings that threatened Indonesia's stability and security. Moreover, it was clear that Lim had been killed to prevent him from exposing these operations. Yet, the more Santoso uncovered, the more his own safety became jeopardized. The military establishment was now fully aware of his investigation, and Santoso had become a marked man. He began to receive anonymous threats, his family was followed, and even his closest allies started to back away from him. Santoso was forced to take extra precautions, frequently changing his whereabouts and communicating through encrypted channels. Still, he refused to abandon his quest for justice, knowing that the country's future depended on exposing the full extent of the corruption within its military leadership. The tipping point came when Santoso was approached by a high-ranking politician who had heard about his investigation. The politician, who had been a staunch critic of the military's influence, offered Santoso a deal. In exchange for his silence and the cessation of his investigation, the politician promised to provide him with protection, as well as a significant financial reward. It was a tempting offer, one that many other officers would have taken without hesitation. But Santoso was resolute. He could not let Lim Tan's murder be swept under the rug, nor could he allow Waira and his criminal network to continue operating unchecked. With the support of his closest allies, Santoso decided to go public with his findings. The move was calculated. He knew that the more exposure the case received, the harder it would be for the military to suppress it. Santoso leaked a portion of the evidence to the press, knowing that the scandal would cause an uproar in both the public and political spheres. He hoped that the outcry would put pressure on the government to take action against Colonel Waira and his associates. The media quickly picked up the story, and soon the public was outraged by the revelations of widespread corruption within the military. Protests erupted in major cities across Indonesia, as citizens demanded accountability and transparency. The government was forced to respond, but the military's influence was still too powerful. Rather than holding Waira accountable, the authorities attempted to downplay the scandal, framing the case as an isolated incident involving a rogue officer. Santoso's leaked evidence was dismissed as unreliable, and he was publicly discredited. In the face of such an overwhelming backlash, Santoso knew that his chances of seeing justice served were slim. Despite the public outcry, the military quickly moved to silence him. He was reassigned to a remote post in East Java, far from the political turmoil in Jakarta. His investigation was effectively shut down, and the case of Lim Tan's murder was officially closed. The media, under pressure from the military, was forced to retract its reports, and the public's interest in the case began to wane. But for Santoso, the fight was far from over. Although the military had succeeded in suppressing the case, he knew that the truth would eventually come to light. The evidence he had gathered was irrefutable, and there were still individuals willing to speak out against the corruption that had permeated the highest echelons of the Indonesian government. Santoso's resolve remained unshaken, even in the face of overwhelming odds. He had started the investigation with a single goal in mind, to uncover the truth, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Over the following years, Santoso continued to gather evidence, working quietly from the shadows. He built a network of informants and allies, each committed to bringing justice to those who had been wronged. Although the case of Lim Tan's murder was officially closed, The seeds of a broader movement had been planted, one that would eventually lead to a reckoning with the military's unchecked power. While the government and military had managed to suppress Santoso's investigation for a time, they had underestimated the power of the truth. The public, though silenced for a time, would not forget. And as the years passed, the ghosts of Lim Tan's murder and the corruption that had led to it would continue to haunt Indonesia's political landscape, ensuring that the fight for justice was far from over.